Okay, let's go ahead and get started since it's time. So first, I want to thank everyone for joining today. What we're going to talk about is BlastWave working with Inductive Automation and their ignition system for providing security for OT environments. I have with me some good panelists here who are going to give their perspective on it. First and foremost, it's Travis Cox. Travis, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks for having me here, Cam. And hello, everybody. My name is Travis Cox. I'm the Chief Technology Evangelist for Inductive Automation. I've been at the company for 22 years and have always had a focus working with customers and partners on and figuring out the art of the possible, making architecture integrations be easy and work well.
Right, so Travis is here to give the perspective of from the inductive automation perspective, why security is important and what are some of those kind of challenges from the infrastructure vendor's perspective. The next guest we have is going to give the perspective of how people attack and penetrate OT environments. Aaron, you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, absolutely. Great to meet y'all. Aaron Boyd. I am an OT penetration tester. I've spent more than a decade of my career breaking into these complex environments and also doing vulnerability assessments against them. And definitely looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and Aaron's perspective is really important here because what he's going to talk about are the kind of unique issues that OT faces when it comes to security versus IT, and how that kind of generates new challenges for people who are trying to put out security in for those systems. And my name is Cam Cullen. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for BlastWave, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our solution, how we can help protect solutions and networks that are using inductive solutions to provide their OT infrastructure. And just so I know we have a varied audience here, but this webinar, it's both for resellers of both BlastWave and Inductive, but also for customers who may have these systems deployed. So we're going to talk a little bit out of both sides of our mouth here during the session. And if you have questions, obviously, feel free to let us know what your questions are. But we want to make sure we address both sides because one of the interesting things that Travis will talk about is, how do you get buy-in to deploy both these automation systems, maybe in the cloud, maybe just connected at all, and still provide the security for them. So we all know that protecting OT is hard. Aaron mentioned he's been doing this for a very long time. Travis said he's been doing this for over 20 years. So I'm not going to go through all of these issues, but the world has changed in terms of OT. It used to be, oh, it's air gap, no one can get in, everyone has to physically be there. That is not the case anymore. Between remote access for all the devices, data historians collecting data, cloud repositories, cloud SCADA systems, all of these have kind of opened up the aperture a little bit for OT. And the solution to this is not to put your head in the sand and say, oh, it's too hard, I give up, I'm not going to get hacked because no one really cares about me. I think it's important to remember how powerful these AI-based systems are and scanning systems that basically can scan the entire internet in moments, essentially, to find open and unprotected devices. So what I want to do first is let Travis talk a little bit about the perspective from inductive automation and how they look at this problem and how they look at the market in general for their solutions. So Travis, I'll turn it over to you and you just tell me when you're ready to go.
Perfect. All right. So first, just for those of you who may not be familiar with us, Inductive Automation, we are a software company and that we focus on industrial automation software. We don't provide any hardware or services. We just focus on our platform, Ignition. Ignition is used every single day inside some of the world's biggest companies with a highly diversified customer base across all industries, with thousands of Ignition installations in over 140 countries. And we have a very strong integrator network with over 5,000 integrators worldwide who provide services to their customers. And we've been in the industry for over 23 years, and we have over 400 employees here in the US and in Australia. So that's about us. Our software products, if you go to the next slide, Ignition. It's an unlimited platform for enterprise integration, industrial applications, and more. Ignition acts as a central hub for everything on the plant floor and beyond. It's web-based, it's web-managed, it's web deployable to desktops, industrial displays, and mobile devices, and it has an unlimited licensing model. So it allows you to have as many tags, screens, clients, device connections as you want. You get a perpetual license, and you can add as much as that hardware will allow you to do. It's cross-platform and it offers industrial strength security and stability. Of course, security is something we're going to be talking a lot about here today. And all this empowers you to build any kind of industrial application. So whether you need SCADA, MES, IoT, or any other type of solution, it starts with Ignition. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. One of the things that I want to start with is something pretty simple. Ignition is secure by design, and we take that very seriously here at Inductive Automation. In fact, you can go to our trust portal at security.inductiveautomation.com, and you can learn about all the different things that we're doing as a software company. But security doesn't just stop at the edge of the software. There's an entire environment around it, and that's really what I want to spend the next 10 minutes here on. If you think about what Ignition actually does today, it's not just an HMI sitting on one machine watching one process. It's edge to cloud data pipelines, it's MQTT topologies, publishing data across dozens of sites, it's mobile visualization, putting live plant data in someone's pocket while they're standing in the parking lot or different parts of the facility. And it's not just talking to itself anymore. It's Ignition's exchanging data with CMS platforms, ERP systems, MES systems, that used to live in completely separate worlds and now expect a live constant feed from the plant floor. The old model, that layered air-gapped pyramid approach where everything stayed neatly inside its lane, just doesn't describe how anyone builds systems anymore. The perimeter used to be a circle drawn around the plant. Now it has tendrils reaching out into IT and into the cloud. And honestly, that's not a mistake. That's the job. The real question isn't about how we stop that from happening. It's what we do. It's how we do that responsibly. So it's the shape of the problem, what's actually at stake when we get it wrong. Okay, so next slide. None of what I'm about to say here is new to a lot of you. We live this every single day. There's legacy equipment out there running operating systems that haven't been supported in years, many of them fundamentally insecure and genuinely difficult to patch, because patching means downtime, and downtime isn't always an option when a line has to keep running. On top of that, a lot of equipment is still talking over legacy protocols that were never designed with security in mind. No authentication, no encryption, just the assumption that if you're on the network, you're supposed to be there. Those protocols aren't going away either. So they need to be protected at the network level because they can't protect themselves. Then there's third-party contractual access that isn't going anywhere either. Vendors need in, and that's a standing risk, not a one-time event. There are sensors, there's smart meters and IoT devices being added constantly for efficiency and uptime, and some of them have turn out to have external-facing IPs that nobody realized were exposed. And then there's shadow IT, connections that nobody signed on and most people don't even know exist. None of this is anyone's fault, really. It's what happens when operational necessity moves faster than the IT process. So next slide. What we're talking about here is OT-IT convergence, and it represents a fundamental shift because for decades there was a clear divide between these two spheres, as Cam said. But OT and IT were built, maintained, supported, and it's completely separate worlds with different teams, separate priorities, and honestly, separate cultures. That divide is exactly what led those tendrils I mentioned about a minute ago from the plant floor into IT, into the cloud, without anyone fully reckoning what that meant. Ignition didn't create that convergence, but it lives right at the center of it because it's the thing actually moving data across that boundary every single day. So the two worlds that used to operate independently now have to operate as one system, whether the org charts have caught up to that or not. And that's not a hypothetical problem for some future state. It's the reality of every one of you is living with right now every day. Next slide. So let's talk about what's actually meeting here in the middle. OT is the physical side, the machinery, the plant equipment, the industrial hardware and software running on the plant floor. OT professionals live in PLCs, HMIs, SCADA systems, the tools built for monitoring and controlling a physical process in real time. IT lives in a different world entirely. Rapid scaling, cloud infrastructure, web-based deployment, security postures that assume you can patch on Tuesday and reboot on Wednesday. None of that assumption holds on a plant floor, and that mismatch is exactly where you sit. OT wants flexibility and uptime. IT wants control and lockdown. Integrators live in the gap between these two, and it shows up in every deal, in arguments about access control, about open ports, about how much remote access a vendor should be allowed to have. In the meeting where the plant manager wants remote access turned on for a vendor and the CSIO, the CISO wants zero exposed ports, and somebody has to reconcile that. So here's the question that I want to leave you with, because I think it's the one that matters most. What does an attacker actually do with all of this? So back over to you, Cam.
Yep. So a couple of things that Travis mentioned I wanted to focus on. One, he talked about the tendrils that exist now in the OT network, where it's not just this little flat circle around something. You have these fingers reaching out to all different systems. I think that's really important when we talk about something we call a software-defined perimeter, where your network is no longer a circle or easily bound. It has many places that they extend out, and every time someone logs in, they now become part of that. They become a new tendril off that. So that's an important topic to get on. But I also want to throw this particular image that he has on the screen now. You'll notice all of these things are in their own little box. So they're segmented out, which is going to be another important part about security in this, where each little piece, you talked about remote access. That is something important where you may want to deliver remote access, but maybe it's just to that little box that they have and not everything else. So there are some things we're going to talk about. And what I want to have now is for Aaron to talk about how he looks at this, and he looks at this big connected network and the things that he uses to go after that. So I'm going to turn it over to Aaron, who's now going to talk about, from a penetration perspective, a tester's perspective, what's the reality of these OT environments. So Aaron?
No, absolutely. So some of this will probably sound a little bit repetitive. So apologies in advance for that, but I do think they're important to really drive the message home, because some folks, either live or listening to the recording, come from the IT background that don't know the operational realities of OT that well. So I just want to offer up the reminder that, these industrial control systems and OT environments were really historically engineered with the primary focuses being on availability, determinism, and safety, rather than cybersecurity. So they don't really fall under the confidentiality, integrity, availability triad that we're used to on the IT side of things. And a lot of the systems I still assess today are still operating as if they were designed decades ago, long before we had the business needs of persistent connectivity, remote access, and even before, cyber adversaries were really considered realistic threats. So, things like those PLCs, those programmable logic controllers, distributed control systems, safety instrumentation systems are often deployed in those really physically isolated environments where the assumption always was only trusted engineers would ever interface with those machines. So as a result, things like authentication, encryption, and logging were either minimal or just entirely absent by design. But over time, now business requirements are starting to get introduced, such as centralized monitoring, remote maintenance, vendor access, and IT/OT convergence is really introducing connectivity into these environments without fundamentally re-architecting the security posture. So due to this, now there's somewhat of a mismatch between how the OT systems were designed to operate initially and now the threat landscape that they're exposed to. So those legacy systems, proprietary protocols, embedded devices can't really support the modern endpoint security tools or frequent patching without risking the downtime like that's been mentioned, or also introducing safety incidents. Sometimes a network scan might not take down a PLC, but it might take down one of those communication channels and you won't notice it until you need that message to be sent to where it needs to be sent to. So consequently, due to this, now organizations are forced to operate with known vulnerabilities that persist for years. And the foundational reality that I really think is critical to understand is that OT and security is not the result of negligence. It's just the architectural inheritance of the field. And I think any realistic discussion of modern threats really needs to start by acknowledging that all these environments were never built to withstand adversaries operating at internet scale, speed, and sophistication like they're starting to now. And I do want to have the caveat to share that AI does not create that weakness. It just really exposes and accelerates it. So if we go, perfect. So we'll talk a little bit about the industrialization of vulnerability discovery. And it's really evolved from a largely manual, expert-driven activity into an increasingly industrialized process supported by automation, tooling, and now AI-assisted analysis. So things in the past, identifying flaws in the actual industrial software really required, deep protocol knowledge, expertise, reverse engineering skills, which resulted in a really significant time investment. Today, now there's static analysis tools that are automated. There's fuzzers, there's vulnerability scanners that can analyze those really large code bases and binaries far more quicker than any human was ever able to do before. And AI systems now are further accelerating this by helping prioritize areas of the code, identifying anomalous patterns, and helping correlate findings across multiple software versions or vendors to chain exploits together, which is also super concerning. But the one thing I think that's important to note is that AI does not magically or autonomously discover high impact 0-day vulnerabilities at will, like some marketing campaigns might look to do. What it's really doing is just amplifying the existing techniques by reducing the amount of time and effort required to analyze those complex stacks. So, in context of an OT environment where vendors often reuse common libraries, operating systems, and protocol implementations across product lines, this acceleration really has compounding effects. So, for example, a single flaw in a widely deployed component can ripple across multiple industries simultaneously. And as an OT pen tester, I don't just target oil and gas, I do them all. So when I see one solution in one, there's a good chance those same TTPs will work across multiple verticals. So for defenders, this really means that vulnerabilities are also now being identified and shared faster than ever before, which is now shrinking the window between discovery and exploitation. So the industrialization of all this, I want to remind everyone, is that really doesn't guarantee exploitation, but it just means that obscurity and time alone are no longer the reliable defensive buffers that some may have relied on in the past. And I think it's really important that security teams now assume that any weakness once introduced will eventually be found, and often sooner than you might have anticipated. So now talking a little bit about what we like to call the complexity tax in the layered OT software stacks. So I think a lot of the modern OT environments today carry this tax just as a resultant from the decades of incremental evolution. So we know these industrial environments rarely undergo full redesigns because a plant can't go down, a line can't go down. So instead, what they do is they just accumulate layers of functionality over time. So, a typical OT stack might include real-time operating systems, embedded Linux distributions, proprietary application logic, open source libraries, middleware, protocol converters, and remote management services. But each additional layer being introduced also introduces dependencies. So when you start thinking about things like configuration requirements, potential failure modes, etc., now all this complexity is really directly translating into an expanded attack surface where vulnerabilities may exist not only in one area, being the actual control logic itself, but within the ancillary services within them, such as web interfaces, file transfer mechanisms, logging components, or third-party libraries that are just included for convenience. So I think in many cases, just based on my own reporting and the assessment debriefs I've had with a lot of asset owner operators, is that a lot of asset owners are just not usually fully aware of the software components that are running on these devices, let alone how frequently those things are updated or supported. And what I've been noticing is that this lack of transparency is really making things like risk assessment and remediation extremely difficult. And complexity also really hinders this from a defender's perspective because now testing patches becomes even harder where you're able to do so. Change management slows down, which kudos to you if you even have it. And the likelihood of unintended consequences really increases. So, in contrast for attackers, complexity is an advantage because now that there's more moving parts the system has, now there's more opportunities to find those misconfigurations or overlooked weaknesses, to find those entry points. And I think understanding that asymmetry is key to appreciating why these OT environments just continue to remain vulnerable despite all the significant investments in security tooling. So now where AI actually meaningfully changes the threat equation, and I think that the most significant impact is not necessarily the creation of entirely new classes of attacks, but like I mentioned before, just the acceleration and the scaling of existing ones. So taking those tasks that once really required those skilled analysts, such as reconnaissance, vulnerability triage, and target prioritization, can now be performed more quickly and consistently with AI. So this really increases the speed at which attackers can adapt to defensive measures and identify new opportunities. talk about a specific example, AI-enabled tooling can really rapidly analyze configuration files, network diagrams, or firmware images to highlight the likely weaknesses contained within them. And it can also help correlate information across multiple compromised environments, allowing those attackers to reuse successful techniques more efficiently. But from a defender's perspective, this also introduces that time asymmetry problem I was talking about. While attackers can experiment and iterate very rapidly, now defenders are forced to really carefully test those changes to avoid disrupting those operations, because defenders have to play by rules, attackers really don't. And AI
Yeah.
really.
A question for you, Aaron. So I've seen
Yeah.
one of the things that I saw. I'm curious in your opinion of that. There was a report done where they said that essentially using things like ChatGPT and Claude, once a CVE is announced and released, that they have shown that some of these LLMs could actually read the CVE analysis and then create an attack that leverages that in sometimes less than 10 minutes. And we know that in OT, the patch cycle is hundreds of days, not minutes, and these things are getting exploited now in hours. So I guess that what you're talking about with the asymmetry challenge?
Yep, that's one of them. There's a lot of different things that get combined with it. So, we used to call the term script kiddies for those just find things off the internet, run it without knowing what they're looking at. So we're seeing the same thing with people pasting CVEs into those AI chatbot tools to generate something, but very rarely does it just work out of the box. But if you have somebody skilled using those tools, they can see what's generated, which saved them a significant amount of time, and they could just make some small tweaks, and then that ends up working in production.
All right.
One quick thing I'll mention from a software perspective is that when when we're working with people like Aaron and different organizations, that when a vulnerability is found before the actual announcement of the CVE that goes public, because that is required, that we can do remediation efforts and have a patch ready, and ultimately try to be proactive in getting our especially critical customers to be able to understand and know about this before, if you will, the public is aware. So there's different kind of tactics and things that are happening to help mitigate a little bit, but it is definitely a challenge, especially with the speed of which we can, see the CV and ultimately try to attack, because we know how hard it is to actually do the upgrades, right? Knowing about it's one thing, but doing the upgrades is the other part.
Which is exactly what Aaron's going to talk about here. That's a big challenge.
Yep. The patching reality, or the patching that happens, if at all. So we know patching in OT fundamentally different, not only from we can't risk the downtime or things like we said, but just as a pen tester, I've seen a lot of patches actually not fix the problems, but they fix the public proof of concept code from working. There's still a lot of things that are quote unquote patched, but aren't really. That I won't go too much into detail here. Feel free to reach out if you're curious on some of those. But a lot of these assets just continually to operate continuously and just cannot be taken offline without impacting things like safety, production, or the one that's most often overlooked, in my opinion, is regulatory compliance. So, even when patches are available, you have to do those extensive testing to ensure that those updates do not interfere with the performance or deterministic behavior like the environment was built for. And even in some cases, you might not even have patches available at all, because the vendors either no longer support those legacy platforms, or they just exited the market entirely, which is also very common in this industry. So as a result of all this, known vulnerabilities just continue to remain unaddressed for extended periods, sometimes measured in years rather than months, like Cam was mentioning. And a lot of industry studies out there frequently cite that average remediation timelines are well over 200 days in enterprise environments, and OT timelines are even longer due to the operational constraints. So what this ends up doing is it really creates a persistent exposure window that we could just exploit at our leisure if anything's remotely exposed. And I think that the challenge is not so much just the lack of awareness, but just a lack of viable options. I mean, if there's not a patch available, there's not much you can do, but we'll definitely go in a little bit more on some of the other things you can do later. So I think understanding that constraint is essential when you're evaluating, your security strategies, where any approach that assumes, rapid comprehensive patching in OT environments is just unlikely to be realistic. And I hope that's something these auditing firms really start to understand and grasp versus chase us down with checklists. So diving a little bit more on that time asymmetry I was talking about between attackers and defenders, and I think one of the key defining characteristics of modern day risk in OT environments is still that symmetry. So attackers being able to move as quickly as possible when a vulnerability is discovered or a misconfiguration is identified, where defenders, by contrast, you have to follow your own deliberate processes that include things like risk assessments, testing, change approval, deployment, and each step is really necessary to maintain, that safe and reliable operations of your sites. But it also collectively slows response times. So the mismatch really creates a structural disadvantage for defenders, particularly when it's being combined with the increased automation that the attackers now have. And these AI tools further compress the attacker's timeline by enabling those things like the rapid reconnaissance and repeated attempts at exploitation. Defenders cannot really just move faster without increasing the risk of outages or safety incidents. So ultimately, that means prevention strategies are now based solely on rapid detection and response, and it's really strained in OT contexts. Reducing exposure and also limits the consequences of compromise really become critical compensating controls. So the key takeaways that I really hope to drive home is that, examining these OT vulnerabilities is that most of the risk is really structural rather than it is technical. Any breach that happens typically only occurs not because, these attackers are exceptionally sophisticated. A lot of them are still those script kiddies I was talking about that just spray and pray and hope something works. But these environments just continue to be incredibly complex. Some of them are exposed more than they probably should be, and some of the customers don't even know that they're that exposed, and they're really difficult to change. And AI just further intensifies these by accelerating discovery and exploitation. But the key point to remember is it just does not fundamentally alter the underlying weaknesses. And I think for effective OT security, you really need to focus on architectural decisions, just reducing those unnecessary services, limiting exposure, enforcing segmentation, and design systems that just assume compromise rather than perfection. And most certainly, tools and algorithms can help, but they cannot compensate for the insecure foundations in place. And I think by understanding how vulnerabilities arise and why they continue to persist in OT environments, operators can really make more informed decisions about where to invest the limited resources that they have today. And structural resilience rather than reactive remediation alone just continues to be the most realistic path forward I see, in a world where just attackers continue to operate at machine speed.
Mm-hmm. So we have an environment now that's been presented where Travis has talked about these tendrils that exist and all the connectivity and remote maintenance that exists. So we now have a scenario where you have this massive amount of connectivity from your OT network as a potential issue to deal with. And Aaron's talked about how he can exploit those. And it's also important to recognize that sometimes he mentioned as architectural, sometimes the problem. There have been infamous cases where some of the key protocols like SSL with Heartbleed, for example, was a very infamous case where the protocol had a flaw which allowed it to be exploited. So it doesn't matter how well someone implemented that protocol and secured their system, the protocol itself was flawed. And one of the things that Mythos has put a lot of fear in people is this open source technology can be basically now completely investigated by AI and find these daisy chain vulnerabilities. So we have a scenario where we have a lot of connectivity. You have things like shadow IT. You've got all this. So how do you manage to keep your OT network secure? As Aaron mentioned, the hacker's playbook really hasn't changed. So, the script kiddies that he referred to, frankly, they're just AI script kiddies in a lot of cases. The AI is just a lot smarter and faster at implementing them. So they haven't changed the way they do it. To Aaron's point, the AI isn't changing the way they're doing it, it's just making it faster. So we know what they're doing. And what's happened specifically for OT, we've evolved what we're trying to do for OT. And the recent FortiBleed hubbub issue, catastrophe, depending on your perspective on the whole thing, has kind of shown that firewalls that rely on things like authentication and usernames and passwords are not necessarily the right solution for OT networks that are looking to be a little bit separate and protected from the IT side of the house. Some people call it zero trust, some call it just OT security. But I think what's really important when we look at what is needed, the practical solution in this scenario is to try and neutralize the methods that the adversaries use to attack. If you look at, we did a study at BlastWave called Hackopedia, which did just 23 of some of the most well-known attacks in OT space in history. And the two main pieces that came out were compromised credentials, passwords. Over 90% of generic attacks do involve credential theft. People live, and that's what Fortibly was about, getting access to the not just the passwords on the systems, but the actual firewall password itself, which means I can have access to anything because I can change policies and get in. The other part, and both Travis and Aaron mentioned this, there are systems that are exposed to the internet, whether on purpose or by accident, because they need to connect and talk to certain things, or by accident. What we believe in at BlastWave is important is a technology called network cloaking, which essentially means that you cannot ping, see, authenticate, or even get any response from a system unless you are authenticated, which, by the way, does not use a password. It uses biometrics and device-centric authentication. So until you actually authenticate to yourself to the network, you don't see anything at all on that network. So that's really important from a security perspective. I did want to just make sure I mentioned, if you have any questions, make sure to enter them in either the Q&A panel, and I'll get to those as well. And then the final thing I just wanted to touch upon was the segmentation, which is I talked about in the hex diagram that Travis had. Want to make sure that you keep your components in different segments on the network, so that if something does get compromised, if a system gets compromised, if a PLC gets compromised, that someone can't go to that PLC and now get into the ignition system or jump in through the allowed protocols and do bad things as a result of that. When you combine BlastWave with ignition, the main point at which we'll do is we use the gateway to protect that entire OT network. So you can't get in and see any of the systems inside that OT network unless you authenticating and are allowed to enter into a particular segment of that network. Everything is cloaked behind that. The system itself does not respond unless you have the single packet authentication and you are invited into the network. If there are cloud-based components, this including if the ignition is running in the cloud, you can stick agents on that let them be part of those tendrils that come out. So not only as remote access users come in, they join that software-defined network, but also the host space, whether that's an agent for the cloud or one of the other servers that's locally, you can do that. I'm not going to jump into all of the details behind this, but if you are interested, there is a solution brief that's both on the Inductive Automation side as well as ours, about the integration of the two solutions and how we do that, and describing that integration, how you can tie them together. But what I wanted to do was just give you, as I mentioned, to these issues that IT and OT have, and the resellers and the customers themselves. What I wanted to do is kind of bring up some of those challenges, but give the perspective of what some of our customers have done, some of which use actually inductive automation solutions as part of their network, what they have accomplished with our solution. So what are the issues that often get brought up when, oh, I need to secure my OT network and I want to use something besides maybe the firewall that I already have, or I need a new solution to do secure remote access to enable this site to be remote. Aaron mentioned oil and gas. If you think that in Midland, Texas, they're going to drive out 100 miles in the middle of nowhere just to flip a switch on a firewall or to add a new user locally to one of those systems, that's not going to happen. So there are cases where remote access is not just convenience, it is mandatory. So one of the biggest issues, and Travis mentioned this right off the start, as did Aaron, uptime and operations have to keep going for OT. We had a customer that essentially acquired another asset as part of a merger and acquisition. They were able to add hundreds of remote sites and tens of thousands of new devices to their network, essentially with no downtime, by using the Blast Shield system to deploy that. So there are ways to deploy these systems where literally only a downtime is when you flip the connectivity from the firewall to the new Blast Shield system, which is literally a sub-second kind of failover. So you can do this and maintain your operations properly without affecting the uptime of your system. The question we always get, this is a problem, is it worth the investment? The question there, and Aaron has talked about this in many forums I've seen, it all comes down to your risk management. If you don't believe there's a financial risk to getting hacked, or you think your current system provides you that protection, then that's what you should stick with. However, in today's environment where downtime can cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars an hour, we have basically return on security investment or return on investment deployments where literally an hour of downtime pays for 5 years of a Blast Shield system. And we have delivered over 500 million protected device hours without a successful hack in any deployments or in penetration testing. And actually, the way we met Aaron was he was doing a penetration test for a customer, and he could not succeed, and found out that was BlastWave was the reason that he couldn't, and that's how we got introduced and how we made the connection. So we're not perfect. No one's going to be perfect long term, but as of yet, we're still that undefeated, and we have some unique architectural advantages in our solution, which makes us a lot harder to get to, like not using passwords, not having an open web interface. When you connect to our system, if you want to be an administrator, you actually have to authenticate yourself once as a user, and then authenticate yourself again as the administrator, almost in the old SU to root kind of phenomena for the old folks in the room who know what that means. So there's a lot of security investment protection that we do as part of our deployments. And Travis mentioned this, as did Aaron. You have systems, and this is a real picture I found on the internet of someone running Windows 98 to run one of their OT systems in production. You can see these are old. I think that's like a 486 computer or something sitting there running this Windows 98. How do you protect these systems that weren't designed for security? They're never going to be updated. In fact, they can't be. As Aaron said, they've been discontinued by the administrator, and I still need them to talk to my ignition system, and I need them to do their job. We can essentially perform an agentless proxy for these systems to make sure that only people that can talk to them are authenticated properly. And most importantly, you don't have to worry about patch management if the only thing they can do is talk to a specific system on the network, and only certain protocols at only certain times for only certain users. So you can drastically reduce their attack surface. So the minimal exposure that you have is only from insiders and not from outsiders from an attack perspective. And then one we have seen all the time, and if you're in the manufacturing space and you're dealing with IEC 62443, the segmentation, trying to do this with a firewall, an IT firewall specifically, we're using VLANs, and you're trying to replug in your network and re-IP your infrastructure. We've had customers tell us it could have taken them 2 years to do the segmentation project they wanted with a firewall. We've had customers that can install and deploy software-defined zones in hours, with no downtime, no reconfiguration of hardware. It's essentially treated our system as a software-defined network, and we take a flat network and we can segment that through the use of managed switches and an SDN type technology. So we can do that segmentation and make it painless for you, or not. So you can only have maybe a lot of oil and gas customers. They just do segmentation at the site level and do not go down to the device level. So you can decide what your risk exposure is, what your tolerance is, and make sure that you optimize your deployment for that. Latency is very important. Some environments, latency is something where it would actually cause alarms and failures and emergency systems to go up in the system. So you want to make sure that latency doesn't become a problem, as well as an operational impediment for the people who are trying to maintain these systems. And if you do have a problem, what you'll find is shadow IT will creep in and people will work around your systems to get what they want without it. Um, Again, performance is a nice thing. I won't go into it, but we have both a full interactive remote access client with Blast Shield, as well as Blast Access, which is a secure remote desktop solution that both have chosen to be far faster than RDP and PAM solutions, while still keeping passwordless access, all the security, and part of that software-defined perimeter that I mentioned. And then that agents and MFA, again, these systems were not designed for that. But phishing is basically eliminated as a threat vector with our systems because we don't use passwords. It's tied to biometrics, devices, root keys, device keys, and protected enclaves, a whole lot of stuff that we can go into detail. If you're interested about Ignition, BlastWave, or even using Aaron, feel free to reach out to anyone on this webinar. I think our email addresses are part of the webinar page. Mine is cam@blastwave. If you're interested in a demo, we're happy to do that. But what I wanted to do kind of is first, join the movement to prevent industrial cyber attacks. We as BlastWave can't do that. Travis can't do it by himself. Aaron is certainly doing his part to try and help these networks be secure. But what it really comes down to you and as the customer and the resellers who are helping the people do that. But I do want to open it up for questions. We do have a question that's come in. It says, how are biometrics protected and eventually destroyed after an employee or vendor ends a relationship with the OT and IT network? You can type out, or you can basically time out authentication. You can time bound it. When you delete their profile, we don't actually store biometrics as part of this. What we do is we use the same principle that both Google Pay, Google Wallet, and Apple Pay use, where the user authenticates themselves to their device core with the key in the protected key store, and we just accept that the device, which we now have a public and private key pair for, are authenticated and accepted that. So there's some nuances there. We actually require a QR code scan, so you can't automate that act because it does require a human in the loop. So there's some separation in that, and you would have to literally to break into a BlastWave protected system, you'd have to both get into the root access of the laptop or the system that the user is doing, have total control of the PC, as well as total control and protected device key store access onto the mobile device that they're using for authentication, which is not a very likely thing, as well as making them interact with the QR code that's on their screen at any one time. But I do have some questions that I want to ask for Travis. Travis, OT customers often complain that the corporate IT doesn't understand that. And we have seen at BlastWave over the past year or two, a shift in where now IT is being asked to go help OT or take over the OT security issue. What are your thoughts on some of the differences between OT and IT, and how do you deal with that when you get now a new IT guy that says, how do I secure my Ignition system?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's been an evolution for sure. I mean, historically, as we've talked about with OT, they had separate environments completely, right? They had their own, a lot of times the credentials logging in were just stored in these systems. You often would even see sticky notes next to machine with the credentials on them. That then got into like Active Directory, and they would have their own Active Directory server, wouldn't be able to connect to the business side, and so that there's always kind of been a lot of challenges there. What really where it comes down to now is basically I love having both the IT professionals and the OT professionals in the room to basically understand the two sides of the fence and what we're trying to do collectively. Because they're on the IT side, the technology has moved quite fast, and what you need is OT technologies that understand and that bring in those modern practices. So, for example, with Ignition, a lot of times now with authentication, it's identity providers, right? Using corporate identity systems, and when have the two professionals in the room, you talk about these things, then they instantly are on the same side because you're talking the same language, and they can control and protect that. Same thing with if we're deploying our software. A lot of times it would be, before people would buy their own servers or it'd be their own virtual machines, and now IT folks want to leverage a lot of Kubernetes or their own container-based systems and have centralized deployment. Well, these technologies support that. It makes it easier for them to bring that technology in and understand how to secure and work with it. So it's really just getting more education and awareness of the two sides and what we're trying to do, and for the systems that are on the OT to try to modernize them as much as possible. A lot of it, there's still gonna be a lot of legacy out there, but it's it's multifaceted in terms of how you can approach it.
Have you seen, Aaron, in your testing that IT is often the entryway you use to get into OT?
9 times out of 10, yeah. Most of my assessments are IT to OT perimeter test or assume breach because that tends to deliver the most value. As a lot of customers are starting to ask when it happens, not if it happens, because eventually somebody's going to click on a link somewhere, somebody's going to get access into something somehow. What can they do when they eventually get there? So that tends to be what most of my assessments are these days.
Yeah, and again, when I did the Hackopedia research, that definitely has called out so many of the worst attacks came when people got into IT and just leaked over into OT because through various vulnerabilities, passwords, etc. So that is a bit of a challenge. I did mention that Aaron, we kind of met you by you were doing a assessment on this. When you're looking at a network, what is something like network cloaking? What does that do to make your challenge harder, I guess, as a tester?
Yeah, 100%. So that actually is a real thing for those on the call. I got introduced. So one of my customers I do annual testing for, I went to do the annual test this year, complete change from what I did last year. So after banging my head on the wall more than I've ever banged my head, I'm like, what did you guys do? And then they started talking about BlastWave. They started showing it to me. And I just reached out. I'm like, what are you guys doing? Because they're doing something I haven't seen in the market yet. But basically it took everything I was able to identify and correlate on the network, from host names, network traffic, credentials, the things we expect to see unencrypted in OT environments. It was all obfuscated. I had no idea, no clue what I was looking at. I wasn't able to find an entryway in, and because I wasn't defined in any of those access policies, I couldn't do anything. I could see the traffic, but I couldn't do anything with it, and I couldn't land anywhere other than the initial entry point I was given to determine what was I able to do once I got there. So completely changed the game.
Excellent. And Travis, you mentioned something in your part that I want to kind of come back to. You talked about the remote access component of this, and inductive. You need your access to it. All of the SCADA other vendors and all of the PLC vendors and the HMI. How do you see that being a challenge? When your system may be secure, but suddenly everyone who can get into it by using those other systems. How do you view secure remote access as a security challenge, but yet an imperative for an OT deployment?
Yeah, I mean it's absolutely an imperative, and you look at certain industries like take oil and gas as an example. A lot of remote sites, historically, when they wanted to go see what was going on with that site, what would they do? They drive out to that site, look at the systems that were there, and that's quite costly, both in time, and in gas and everything, for that to happen, and speed, right, to resolving issues. Whereas now they kind of expect, right? We expect in our personal lives to be able to get everything on our phone. That's how a lot of operators are. They want to be able to see it right then and there. And it's taken a long time to kind of get to the place of even leveraging mobile devices. Before it'd be laptops where they'd have to VPN in and they'd VPN in, and it would be this layered approach, right? You start at the top and you kind of go through jump points all the way down, and it would again be about time and be about trying. So what they do, they would put shadow IT things in, right, to help make their lives better, because they need to see that data. They need to be able to stay connected to the operations. And with Ignition, we have our perspective module, which is native HTML5. So you don't need anything but a modern browser, and that makes it really easy. But you have to have everything in place to be able to allow that person to see it, whether they're on Wi-Fi, even if you have Wi-Fi at the site, or if they're somewhere to be able to do that securely, and within networks, you see things like DMZs and being able to kind of jump through that, or you see people just pushing data to the cloud and having a read-only version that people can actually look at from the cloud perspective. So there's all sorts of different approaches that happen, but The reality is it is required, and the more that we can make it possible but secure it by design from the get-go, so that people can do their job, and we know that we're not opening up vulnerabilities, the better you're going to be.
Yeah. Aaron, have you seen any networks in the past 3 or 4 years that you've tested that have no remote access at all?
Two, but they were research labs. So
Okay,
there
okay.
there stands reason why they don't. So
Yeah, I have a lot of fun with those research labs. I started my career at NSA, and even if people think, oh, then the government must be air gap. No, they're just sitting behind encryption devices that you can't get into because you don't have that cryptography suite essentially available to you. So everything nowadays is connected. We actually had a customer in the military that said, "Oh, we're just going to air gap everything," and we're like, "You think you're going to air gap?" But when I was at NSA, we actually did a after action evaluation of a hack that occurred, and literally a colonel had put a second NIC card in the back of his computer so he could connect to that secret system that he didn't tell anybody about, and he was hoping he would just not get caught because it was convenient for him. And yep, that's exactly what someone found and got into it. So that air gap really doesn't exist anymore. So it is a problem.
Well, the other thing to mention too
It
is,
doesn't look. Go ahead.
sorry, real quick, is not just the
Yeah, go ahead.
operators that are there need the remote access. There's also, of course, I mean, let's talk about integrators who need to support these systems, right? These are pretty sophisticated control systems that are put in place, and if something goes wrong from a troubleshooting standpoint, it's if you're down, having to wait for an integrator to drive into the site to be able to start troubleshooting, that is a lot of lost opportunity and money. Whereas if they can actually remote access in, be able to see what's going on and to even potentially make some changes, that is where things are now, and it's kind of expected. But that also adds a whole layer of complexity because you have to manage all of these different vendors and their access and what they have access to exactly and what they can and cannot do with these systems, whether they can, not read from PLCs or even change a control strategy on PLCs live. Like there's a lot of course, to consider with all of this. But it's like I said, it's multi-nuanced. The OT world is quite complex. There's a lot that has to work.
Yeah, anyone that's watched the show Landman can appreciate the challenges, some of the literally the remoteness of those, and in some cases, actually, as we saw in that show, those can be dangerous sites because they're in the middle of nowhere, and you don't know who's going to be out there when you get out. So it is something that we now need to have. The systems need to be connected. We just have to make sure that's connected in the right and secure way. So I think that's all we have. It didn't look like we had any more questions in. If you have any questions, if you're curious about this, you want to see that solution brief I mentioned, or you just want to experience either Ignition, what Aaron does for penetration testing, or BlastWave, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to help you. And the goal here, again, is to keep your network safe and prevent these industrial cyber attacks and not have you be the next case study I do for our Hackopedia. So thanks to Travis, thanks to Aaron. Appreciate everyone who took the time to the US today. And if you have any colleagues that missed this who you think would have benefit, just let them know, and we'll have the replay sent out here probably within the next 24 hours. Thanks, everyone.